Should children in schools across England be forced to wear masks again, to socially distance, even perhaps take an extended 2-week half-term break in a bid to tackle rising COVID rates in the classroom?
Well, one of our guests in a moment will tell us that she thinks that toddlers as young as 2 should be put into masks. We'll talk about that. Meanwhile, on the 16th of September, at least 122,000 pupils were off school. 2 weeks later, the latest Department of Education figures show that more than 204,000 children were off school. That's
2.5% of all pupils in England, nearly a 70% increase.
So it really is shooting up. So joining us now is primary school head teacher Bryony Baines and Sarah Saul, the co-founder of the parent group Safe Education for All. And actually, Sarah, it's you, I've just been told in the commercial break, one of the measures you think schools and nurseries and playgroups should be taking is putting 2-year-olds in face masks. I mean, how is that? You'd have to super glue them on. I mean, 2-year-olds aren't going to keep a face mask on, are they?
First of all, you're misquoting me completely. So whoever gave you that information, it's a misquote.
All right.
What I did say is, in other countries, children as young as 2 have been asked and have been taught how to wear a mask. I didn't say that's what we needed in this country, but I did say we are exception to all other countries, but not encouraging and explaining that COVID is airborne and explaining to children how to safely use a mask and use good mask hygiene principles in an age-appropriate way.
Well, OK, well, I suspect then, just to be clear, that you quoting that statistic was probably taken as a comment of approval. Do you think it's a good idea for 2-year-olds to wear face masks?
I think a scientifically recognised mitigation against an airborne virus, if it can be used, should be used by those who are able to use it. So I'm not saying there's a blanket rule that any child of a certain age and above should wear one. I'm saying it's there as a mitigation and should be explored.
Bryony Baines, what are the current rules in primary schools on masks? Is it now down to local head teachers to decide?
Yes, there's no regulation that says we have to wear masks in school. And I can speak for my school, we aren't wearing masks. The children aren't, and neither are the staff. We are observing bubbles as much as we can, large bubbles, larger than previously. And we are trying as much as we can to socially distance, to clean, etc. We've been very fortunate in that although we have cases, we haven't had any in-school transmission of the virus at all.
There are a number of schools dealing with huge amounts of absences. In secondary schools, 1 in 7 pupils are out of school. And there are some head teachers who are wondering how they can deal with this. What are your colleagues saying? Because you have the bubble system, so you're trying to keep pupils sort of in separate bubbles. You don't want to bring in masks. Are there some of your colleagues who are talking about, for instance, a longer gap at half-term as a sort of circuit breaker?
I have heard that mentioned. I don't think that's a good idea. I don't think it would serve any good. I think that we need to live with this. We've got to find ways of dealing with it, and we cannot shut the schools every time infection rates rise. Children have missed so much education, and to close the schools for any more would be disastrous in that respect.
And is the reason... sorry, carry on, do carry on.
No, you go ahead.
I just wanted to go back to the mask. Is the reason that you don't pursue a mask policy at your school because you think it's important for children to be able to see each other's faces and to see teachers' faces and the teachers to see their faces, that you think that's a critical part of life in a daily school life?
Absolutely. We are dealing with primary school children who've already had significant disruptions, and we are trying to teach them to read. How can you teach a child to read when they can't see your mouth? Also, children, very young children, as well as older children, gauge the adult by the expression on their face. And if half of that is gone, it's very hard for them to read, to pick up social cues, to understand, to articulate appropriately. So I just don't think mask wearing would do any good in terms of stopping the virus. And I think in schools, and I think in that respect, it could do more harm than good.
Well, let's go back to Sarah Saul then. Sarah, here we have somebody at the coalface, at the cutting edge, saying no to masks and no to an extended half-term. And there is conversation abroad that we should maybe extend it from 1 to 2 weeks. How would you counter that? Because I know you disagree.
I think we need to start from the very beginning that I and my campaign group and most of the parents, we recognise that in-person education is vitally important for all our children. I have a 15-year-old in his final year of school and a 12-year-old asthmatic child. So I'm speaking from experience. I know what the disruption was like last year. I know how it affects the children's mental health when they are constantly in and out of school. What we're talking about now is the disruption to education is due to high transmission rates. And what we need to discuss is how do we get those transmission and infection rates down in order to keep in-person education sustainable, safe and fair to all. If we start with the premise that there are 3 things we need to keep in mind. COVID is airborne. Even Donald Trump finally figured that out, you know, in his famous interview. It's in the air. Everyone, no matter what age, can transmit and can contract, whether you're vaccinated or not. Varying degrees and lesser negative outcomes if you're vaccinated, of course. However, that is a fact. You can still transmit and you can still contract. And that then no one can guarantee to you how your body will react to infection. OK, Georgia Halliday from Portsmouth, 15-year-old, had no underlying health conditions and died 4 days after contracting COVID.
Can I cut in because I just want you to tell us what you think we should do, because you haven't addressed that. What do you think schools should do?
What should have been done from September 2020 and something we've been campaigning for. In-person education has been able to be sustainable and safe and not contribute to an increased rates of infection in many other countries where they have used a multi-layered, scientifically recognised mitigation strategy. That's not what we have here. What we have here, effectively, is open a window and wash your hands more frequently. That isn't based on any scientifically recognised infection control protocols. Right. So we haven't had a multi-layered, scientifically recognised mitigation strategy in our schools.
OK, Dr Hillary, you wake up in the morning to was going to say a telegram, but an email from the government saying you're the Education Secretary now. What would you do?
Right now, so I think we need to distinguish between primary schools and secondary schools. Secondary schools have the problem with very high rates of infection and rising rates. Primary schools don't have nearly as bad a rising rate as that, probably half as much. Right. So secondary schools, that's where we need to get the vaccination rollout going very quickly, as fast as possible. I think extending half-term to 2 weeks is not going to make much difference because you don't get immunity from that vaccination. Even if you could vaccinate all those children, we're nowhere near 12% at the moment, and a third of those are the clinically vulnerable or living with somebody who's clinically vulnerable. So you can't do it in time anyway. And the vaccination rollout needs to be done in schools because that's where you've got the teams and that's where logistically it's quicker to do.
The needle is the solution.
So the needle is definitely the solution for secondary schools. I don't think primary school children should wear masks. I think it does make education, it is a barrier to communication and education. But I think in secondary schools, I think we should go back to some of those mitigating circumstances with social distancing, with mask wearing in indoor scenarios, proper ventilation, proper filtration of air.
Like in an office.
Like in an office.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Dr Hillary and our guest, thanks very much indeed.